Fargo, the new virtual assistant from Wells Fargo, makes banking faster and easier. Like this.
Fargo, what's my checking account routing number?
And this.
Fargo, turn off my debit card.
And this.
Fargo, what did I spend on groceries last month?
And that's just the beginning. Do you, Fargo? You can. In the Wells Fargo mobile app. Learn more at wellsfargo.com/getfargo.
Terms and conditions apply. Your mobile carrier's availability and message and data rates may apply. Wells Fargo Bank, N.A., member FDIC.
Hello and welcome to Real Menopause Talk. My guest today is Courtney and her beautifully energizing book, Juicy Crones, Free for the Strangest Adventures. If you're a regular listener, you will know that Real Menopause Talk aims to have as many conversations about menopause as possible. And here is another aspect that is woefully overlooked. After perhaps family, post-menopause, after retiring, what next? Well, Jay has plenty of answers. She gives us a fascinating insight into life in the UK in the 1970s when many of us were growing up. She shares how she brought Juicy Crones into being and her fabulous sense of exploration and embracing her true self. Jay, it is an honour and a privilege and so exciting to meet you, having read the majority. I will be honest, I haven't quite finished Juicy Crones, but I am loving every minute. It is pure joy.
Oh, thank you so much.
The sort of opening chapters are very much a conversation that, even though you're only 10 or so years older than me, that I wish I could have had with my mum, because we used to talk very openly and freely about life and the world, the universe and everything. I just didn't have the opportunity to talk to her about this phase of life and menopause in particular. But she surrounded herself with who I will now refer to as her Juicy Crones, and would go to Crete with them regularly. If they're listening, they know who they are. And obviously she had various other pockets as well, which is just wonderful. The bit that instantly grabbed me was when you put life into context, and you start off with, in 1975, this was the first time that women were allowed to have a bank account in their own name, which I didn't know before. And it floored me. And then women weren't allowed to spend their own money until 1982 in a pub in the UK. Was that just accepted at the time, or how did you feel about it?
I think I never intended to write a sort of, overview of women's rights, but actually I was trying to understand why myself and so many women of my age were struggling to own this bit of their life. Mm-hmm. And so I sort of went right back to the start and thought, what happened to me? I was a successful woman. Why do I feel like this? And then when I started sort of scratching beneath the surface and thinking, oh my goodness, I was born to a mother who actually wasn't born with the right to vote. And then I began to look at the history of women's rights in the UK, let alone the rest of the world, where so many women are still waiting. I thought, oh, maybe this, maybe I did ingest all of this as I went along. And actually, the more I looked at it, the more I thought, I don't think I ever resolved these tensions, So, I grew up with two brothers, and so I was used to seeing them doing what they wanted when they wanted. But that wasn't allowed to me, if you like. So I think it did have a big impact on all of us, but we probably weren't aware of it because whatever is normal for you when you're growing up is normal. Mm-hmm. And it's often not till a lot later on that you begin to understand those things.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, for example, my father didn't want me to learn to drive because I was a girl at school. I was at a mixed school, a very rough school. But actually, my elder brother was an engineer, and I think I might have wanted to follow in his footsteps. But girls weren't allowed to do metalwork or woodwork. They had to do sewing and cookery. And so, just those things where almost at the start, nobody ever said you can't do that. But obviously, if you can't study the subjects, then it's going to be much harder to do that thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I remember domestic science being on and off the table the whole time at school. Should they teach it? Shouldn't they? Should they? Shouldn't they?
Mm.
And even the fact that it had been upgraded, supposedly, to domestic science from home economics.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I remember when the equal pay came in, I was vaguely aware of it. And my father, who was the sweetest, mildest man, said, and he never really passed comment, oh, that's not right, because if, the women get equal pay, then there'll be less money for the breadwinners. And it's
my goodness.
Whoa. And at the time, it twitched in my head, but, I was fairly young. I didn't really understand what was being said. But of course, now when you look at WASPy women and the women who don't have, most women of my age don't have a lot of money in their own right, it's impacted all the way through our lives because most of us didn't have the chance to, put a good pension together, basically.
Well, not having your own bank account in your own name, there's a glass ceiling right there. Or it's not even a glass ceiling, it's just a ceiling.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I know you go into this in your brilliant book, but just to give everybody a little bit of context, could you tell people about you and a little bit more about how you grew up?
Sure. It was a very ordinary upbringing, really. I was, born in a council house. I failed my 11 plus. But the thing that was in my favour was that I was a really keen reader and somehow, don't know how, managed to get myself to university. And once you've done that, your world opens up, doesn't it? And certainly very few of my contemporary girlfriends were able to do that. So I went on to university. I became a teacher in the time-honoured way, and then went into local authority work, leading for children's health and wellbeing in education. And I absolutely loved it. I mean, it was demanding, it was upsetting at times, but actually it was something I really, really believed in and was in my niche, really, advocating for children and young people. So I was extremely lucky and enjoyed that very much until I retired, really.
Wonderful. And you have a family?
Yes, I have 2 beautiful daughters who each have 2 beautiful daughters. So
gosh,
we are a very girl-based family, which, having grown up with brothers myself, is interesting and wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Yeah.
Same. I come from a mother who had a sister, and then I also have a sister. I have 2 daughters. She has 2 daughters. So
that's really interesting.
Yeah,
really interesting.
Very female. I know also you talk about this in the book as well, but I know there will be so many people wondering, how did you come up with the name Juicy Crones?
Well, when I retired, I had a kind of beige few, years where I just couldn't work out who I was at this time, post-menopause, or no work to sort of hang my hook on, if you like. And I did a lot of reading, which is always my go-to place. And I came across this American writer, Jean Shinoda Bolen, and she happened to use the phrase juicy crones. And it just made me laugh out loud. It was just such a sort of a gentle but a pretty hard bat against that idea that postmenopausal women are dried up and dull and past it and all those other horrible, adjectives that are used. So I wrote to her and said, I absolutely just love this phrase. It made me laugh. And I am thinking of writing a book. And if I did, would you allow me to use the phrase? And she wrote back such a lovely email saying, I'd be absolutely thrilled. Please take it and run with it. And it was just such a generous thing to do. And actually, I've got a lot to thank her for, because every time writing the book got tricky, I sort of thought, I owe it to her. She's given me this gift. I should press on and keep going. Yeah.
And I just love it. Initially, I was curious,
yes.
And I have now embraced it completely.
I'm so glad.
No more wizened crones, definitely not.
No.
Juicy crones.
Well, it's colourful, it's slightly naughty, but it's also playful, isn't it? So,
Yes. The fact that you refer to yourself and your peers as postmenopausal is quite revolutionary in itself, because outside of the menopause bubble, there are many people who still find the word quite uncomfortable. Again, it's another thing that I'm totally embracing. Were you aware of adding in this element when you put it into the book or when you talk about it?
No, I didn't set out to write a book about menopause or postmenopause. I was writing a book about, it was a quest, really. I was trying to find women of my era, my age, but postmenopausal women, but I hadn't used that as a label, who were really embracing and doing all these new and wonderful things. That's what I was looking for. And it hadn't occurred to me until actually quite recently that we tend to hear more, thank goodness, about the menopause these days. But nobody seems to be talking about that. And then what what happens after menopause? Do you drop off a cliff then? Or you kind of, just pushed out to sea? And I really wanted then to think, this is actually what it is. It's this ownership of this new life that you can enjoy doing amazing things or just enjoy having a good rest. You don't have to be doing anything. But, it's that whole idea that life doesn't stop post-menopause. In fact, it's almost a relief because, all that up and downness and the hormones, and it's sort of akin to the teenage years, isn't it, where you don't quite know where you are from one day to the next. And then there's a kind of both a period of calm in your life, but also one of excitement and adventure that isn't scuppered by huge hormonal surges or drops, which is the tricky bit, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. And the freedom to choose.
Mm.
So it's very obvious that finding your choice, discovering what you really wanted to do, was a quest in itself. How did you begin?
I began by experimenting, really. I felt very lost. I can't say anything other than feeling I didn't know who I was at this time. I think for many of us, but I think particularly women of this age, you've invested so much in your career or in your children's upbringing or in caring for elderly parents or other members of the family that you've never really had that time to think, who am I in this? Who am I? Have I lost that sense of self? And so it's, for me anyway, and it might not be this case for other women, but there's definitely that sense of exploration, of embracing your true self and beginning to accept who you are, which is sometimes painful, sometimes uncomfortable. We don't always like who we are, do we? But actually, it has been such a breath of fresh air. And I basically did it by experimenting. I tried the things I thought I might enjoy. Sometimes I did, sometimes I didn't. But I also tried the things that I thought, I don't know that that's me. Partly just to learn, is that me or not? So I did things like drawing for the terrified because I've always been told I'm rubbish at art and actually really enjoyed it. I did other things which I thought would be good for my core strength, like Silver Swans ballet, which I sort of enjoyed, but it wasn't me. So that was kind of a disappointment. And then I began to sort of scribble for my own sanity, really, just keeping a journal and so on, and started realising how much I enjoyed writing. And I'd never had that chance before. Yeah.
That is so exciting to hear that you can experiment and you've got time again to do that and then rediscover, as it's a very common theme that we certainly feel throughout perimenopause, maybe even at the start of motherhood for those of us who've had children, that we lose our identity, particularly if originally we've attached it to a career. So rediscovering and redefining yourself is a very exciting time of life. I have this huge privilege where I get to hear people's stories and share them with the world. And you're doing the same. What made you decide to share the stories that you gathered?
I think because it wasn't a conscious quest. I can't claim that at all. It was kind of, who could I talk to? Who could help me? It was as simple as that, really, the sort of everyday thing that we do. I began to meet with other women who, when we got beneath the sort of hello, how are you kind of superficial, actually were in a similar struggle to myself, but I couldn't find or found very little writing about it. A lot of the books I was reading were about appearance, hair and makeup and all that stuff, which is great, but it wasn't the question I was asking. It was about more kind of existential. Who am I? What do I want? And so the more women I began to talk to who were really thinking along the same lines, I thought, I wonder if this would be of benefit to other women, that actually if they could read stories about women they could relate to, would that be helpful? And it seems that it is. I mean, I deliberately didn't choose truly amazing women who do things like row single-handed across the Atlantic. It's just amazing. But personally, I know I could never do that kind of level of anything really, and wouldn't particularly want to. So I didn't go for those women. I went for women who either had had a long-held dream that they'd never been able to fulfill because of all the things we've just talked about, families, careers, money, etc., or women who, like myself, who post-menopause had begun to discover things about themselves that they didn't know at all. That's so rich. It's such, wonderful thing.
One of the stories in particular about the lady, I forget which one now, but read the book, or you've written it, but anyone listening, read the book, you'll find out her name, who had been married. She'd been in a long marriage and then left it and completely changed her life, but almost had to start from scratch, finding out who she was and what she enjoyed, down to the details of what she wanted to eat and how she wanted to dress and when she wanted to leave the house. That was deeply moving. And another one, the heart-led story. I mean, they're all very touching because they're relatable in some way. And to get to be postmenopausal, life is stranger than fiction. I've never met anybody who has had a paint-by-numbers life. There's always been loss or divorce or some great trauma, tragedy and triumph within. Where do you begin to find these nuggets and the real gold and diamond in the stories?
It was a very slow process. It's a huge ask of anyone to tell almost a complete stranger their story, and you know this better than I do. So I did take it very slowly. Some women I approached who I knew were doing really interesting things. Other women came to me to tell their story. Everyone was nervous about it. Everyone wanted to protect their loved ones. They didn't want to expose their family to things that would embarrass or hurt or harm. But equally, we were all of one voice in that we wanted to make women's voices heard. So I think that was true for all of us. I happened to study as a subsidiary subject social anthropology at university, so I'd had some insight into how to do research that kind of got these nuggets going, but also because of a long career in child protection and talking to children, I kind of, it was sort of my field, but I never applied it to older people. So the promise was, and I absolutely kept to the promise, that if at any point they wanted to withdraw or they wanted to change their story, then that was absolutely fine. Obviously, I was hoping they wouldn't, but that was the promise, and I stuck to it. What I did was I spent as much time with each woman as I could, and sadly, because of lockdown, a lot of that meant on Zoom, which isn't ideal, but it was where we were at. As soon as there was any let up and we could go and walk, or even I happen to have a camper van, so quite often I would meet a woman somewhere in a car park. Everything was shut. I'd be in the front seat, they'd be in the back seat, which happened to be 2 meters away. We'd have flasks and blankets. So it was just like the 1950s, really. And we could sit there and have coffee and talk, and it was a very relaxed interview. And after that, I had my first go at telling their story, obviously trying to keep as close as I could to what they told me. And sometimes it was verbatim. But with some of them, I had like up to 14 hours of speech. So I had to kind of get it into a manageable. And for some women, it was the first time they'd ever really told their story. So there was a lot of doubling back, and they were making sense of their story as they told it, really. So that very, very raggedy first draft was sent to them. Then they came back with their thoughts, corrections. Obviously I got some bits wrong and they needed to correct. And it went between us for as many iterations as it took before I actually made them promise that they didn't sign off on it until they could say, yes, this is me. And then it went to print. So it was a long and absolutely wonderful process. Hard work.
Yes.
But actually, it was wonderful.
It sounds it.
Yeah.
And the way women get together, and you refer to this as well, and go for the big stuff, the brazen, raunchy, no holds barred, bare all conversations. It's just wonderful. Yeah. Are there any common themes that stood out for you in particular, or your favourites?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, women talking is just such a joy, and they do cut straight to the chase. I think I loved the fact that we'd all reflected a lot on our early years and how that had shaped and formed us, and how much of that we're trying to actually get rid of in our postmenopausal life. I think many of us had very interesting relationships with our mothers. I'll speak for myself, but it was echoed through other women that my mother was an incredible woman, incredibly bright. During the war, she had done very, very well in the bank and was very successful. And as soon as the men came back from war, she had to leave that job and she just washed up in a cafe. And I think she supported me to get my education and do as well as I did. But there was also mixed with that a little resentment from her, understandably. But if she had been alive today, she'd have probably been the Chancellor. She was really, really able woman. And the more women I spoke to, the more I think that was a story that was echoed, that their mothers had actually resented the restrictions on them. So I think our relationships with parents and siblings, quite a few of us had brothers, and they had a different life experience from us. I was thinking of Andy, who wanted to be a pilot. She felt that she could never live up to her brother, and I think that wasn't an uncommon theme throughout them. And also, in my day, there was almost no childcare, so it was very difficult to actually maintain a career because childcare just wasn't around.
You had to have one or the other, a career or a family, but were very much expected to have a family.
Well, definitely in my era, yes, you were expected to marry young, and that was a very common theme, that most of the women felt they had to marry young, and most of them felt they had to have children young. And that was quite a big pressure on them. Yeah.
Would they have done anything differently, or is it just one of those things that you accept and go, well, this is what has made me today?
I think largely they are accepting. This is who I am. This has made me. But I think, truth be said, many of them are really regretful that they didn't have the chances they wanted as they went through. And that's another good reason for doing it now. I was thinking of Caroline, who's now opened her art gallery. It's something that was always at the back of her mind, always something she wanted to do. But, a marriage, 4 children, etc., the same pattern. It's not to say we don't love our children. Of course we do. We adore our children. We wanted to have children. But it was very difficult then, and it's still actually difficult now, isn't it, with the cost of nursery fees and so on, to do it all.
Yeah, and time, even when the children are at school, it's a very short day if you want to do anything within that time and still have the kids either side.
Yeah.
It remains a challenge for us all, but I do feel things are shifting. Yeah. I'm not quite sure how,
things
but they're
are
definitely changing.
And we need to hold on and maintain that change, because you can see around the world how easily these things are lost.
Perimenopause is teaching me many lessons, which is great, and I hope I hold on to them. What has perimenopause even, taught you?
Well, it was different for me and my cohort, I think, in that it was almost never talked about. It was very difficult to get any advice from doctors and so on at the time. What I wish I'd known now was more about the medicines available and how they might have helped me. I happen to have 2 maternal aunts who had breast cancer, and so the advice to me was not to take HRT, which made for a very bumpy menopause, as you can imagine. I think if I had known, or if I could have had in my head that this period of perimenopause is kind of like the teenage years all over again, where your hormones are just messing with your head and you've got all this cognitive dissonance going on, and you feel rubbish at times and great at other times. If I think I'd known that it was more of a process and that it wasn't heading towards the end but the beginning, psychologically that would have helped me enormously. That actually, okay, it's fairly rubbish at the moment. I need to get all the medical advice I can. I need to look after myself as well as I can. But then it's going to be glorious and wonderful, and I will feel like myself and even better. Then I think it's very hard when you're going through something. It feels like you're heading towards, well, what?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what I didn't know. It was like, well, what happens then? Is that the end? And of course it's not. Most of us will go through menopause in our late 40s, early 50s. Statistically, you've got hopefully 30 years of really lovely life to just hold on to, enjoy, go for it. And I didn't have that message, and I wish I had.
Well, you are clearly giving it out to everybody, and I can't wait for my 50s. I'm going to be 50 this year, and I'm actually genuinely excited about it because I want to have adventures like you and your juicy crones.
Do, yeah.
What next for you?
Well, I've got lots of things in the pipeline. I've had a number of women request that I do some sort of workshopping around giving ourselves permission to do the things we want to do, because we all have those kind of voices in our head. Who was it? Julia something who called it a shitty committee, who just, yes, chattering away saying, oh, you can't do that, and you're too old for this, and you're too fat, and you're too, all of those things. So I think workshopping to overcome those and to experiment with the sense of self and who we are now and, all that stuff will be really helpful. And I'd enjoy running workshops like that. So that's one thing. I also want to start some women's circles. So the chance for women to get together and have some fun, but actually talk about this real stuff, because I think we don't always have the opportunity and we need to make those opportunities, really. I've also got another book starting to form in my head, which I'm trying to keep it at bay at the moment. But I think it's coming.
More strange and juicy adventures, I hope.
I hope so. Yeah, I hope so.
Jay, thank you so much for your time. Is there anything that you would like to add?
I think I'd just like to add, is it Jamie Lee Curtis who said, age is a privilege, age is wonderful. And sadly, I've lost several friends in the recent years who died in their late 50s. And I really do feel I'm really lucky to have this time. Aging is a wonderful thing. Just embrace it, go for it, and have fun, for goodness sake.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation and will enjoy the very finishing of your book and the next one to come.
Thank you so much for having me. I've absolutely enjoyed it. Thank you.
Juicy Crones, Free for the Strangest Adventures is out now, and you can find it wherever you buy your books. And if you're listening at the time of release, we're giving away a copy hot off the presses. Go to @RealMenopauseTalk on Instagram for details. It's quick and simple. Please, could you do us a favour? And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, could you leave us a review and give us a thumbs up? It will ultimately make enough of a difference to keep this podcast going and signposts where we are for everybody who's looking for us. Follow along on anywhere else that you get your podcasts. And thank you for listening. I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.
Wells Fargo presents one of the surest ways to grow your money. A Wells Fargo CD account, where you can earn a 5.00% annual percentage yield on an 11-month term with a minimum opening deposit of $5,000. Visit a Wells Fargo branch or wellsfargo.com/CD rates to open a CD account and start growing your savings with us.
Wells Fargo Bank, N.A., member FDIC.